The airplane cabin starts shaking violently. Overhead compartments burst open. Screams echo through the cabin as metal twists apart right after takeoff. A teenager grips the armrest, frozen in terror, realizing everyone around him is about to die. Then suddenly, silence. He's back at the gate, alive. But in Final Destination, escaping death is only the beginning. At the turn of the millennium, horror movies were changing. The mass slashers of the 1980s had faded into parody, and the late 90s replaced them with a new kind of horror. Smarter, faster, and fully aware of the audience watching. Movies like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer filled theaters with sarcastic teenagers, glossy cinematography, and killers hiding behind mystery twists. Horror had become fun again. But in 2000, Final Destination introduced something different, something colder. Because this movie didn't ask audiences to fear a monster hiding in the shadows. It asked them to fear life itself. A loose screw on an airplane tray, a dripping coffee mug, a crack in the road, a knife left too close to the edge of the kitchen counter. Suddenly, everyday objects felt dangerous. Ordinary life became loaded with tension. And that's what made Final Destination unforgettable. It transformed coincidence into horror. Originally conceived by writer Jeffrey Reddick as an episode of The X-Files, the idea centered around one terrifying question. What happens if someone escapes death, but they were never supposed to? Under directors James Wong and Glen, the premise evolved into one of the most original horror concepts of its era. A movie where death itself became the unseen killer. No face, no voice, no physical form, just inevitability. And maybe that's why the film stayed with people for so long. Because underneath the elaborate accidents and suspenseful set pieces is a deeply uncomfortable truth. Life can change instantly, without warning and without reason. Final Destination tapped into the kind of anxiety that felt bigger than traditional horror. It wasn't about evil winning. It was about realizing you were never fully in control to begin with. 25 years later, people still think about this movie every time turbulence hits on a flight. They still nervously switch lanes behind logging trucks. They still remember the feeling of scanning every background detail for signs that something terrible is about to happen. Because Final Destination didn't just scare audiences, it rewired the way they look at the world. By the late 1990s, horror had become predictable. Audiences knew the formula. A group of teenagers, a mass killer, a few jump scares, and one survivor left standing at the end. Movies like Scream had revived the genre with self-aware humor and slick MTV-style energy. But after a few years, studios began repeating the same ideas over and over again. Horror was entertaining, but it wasn't unsettling in the way it once had been. Then, Final Destination came along and changed the rules entirely. The idea started with writer Jeffrey Reddick, who became fascinated by stories of people avoiding tragedy through strange intuition or coincidence. One real-life story about a woman changing flights after her mother warned her not to board stayed in his mind. That idea slowly evolved into a terrifying concept. What if someone escaped death, but death came back to correct the mistake? Originally, Reddick pitched the story as an episode of The X-Files, and honestly, it makes perfect sense. The premise already carried that late 90s paranoia, premonitions, invisible forces, ordinary people trapped inside something they can't explain. But New Line Cinema saw bigger potential in the concept, especially after Scream proved that younger audiences were hungry for fresh horror ideas. Directors James Wong and Glen reshaped the story into something far darker and more cinematic. Their smartest decision was making death completely invisible. There would be no physical villain chasing the characters, no monster lurking in the shadows. Instead, the environment itself became the threat. That's what made the movie feel different. The audience starts watching every scene with suspicion. A fan spinning too fast, water dripping onto a computer, a loose wire hanging in the background. Final Destination turns ordinary objects into ticking time bombs, forcing viewers into a constant state of anxiety. And once the movie teaches you its rules, it becomes impossible to relax, because suddenly, everything feels dangerous. Before the plane explosion ever happens, Final Destination already feels uneasy. The opening scenes are filled with tiny details most audiences wouldn't normally notice. Nervous glances, flickering lights, close-ups of airplane parts, random sounds growing louder in the background. Director James Wong builds tension slowly, almost like the movie itself is warning viewers that something is wrong before the characters fully realize it. And as Flight 180 leaves the ground, the horror genre is changed forever. Even today, the plane crash sequence remains one of the most effective openings in horror history. Not because it's especially graphic, but because it feels believable. The panic inside the cabin feels real. Oxygen masks drop from the ceiling. Passengers scream over one another. Metal tears apart in seconds. The entire scene captures a specific kind of fear that most people carry with them every time they board a flight. The realism became the movie's greatest weapon. Audiences weren't afraid of supernatural monsters after watching Final Destination. They were afraid of everyday life. The film grounded its horror inside recognizable situations, making every accident feel possible. And once Alex's premonition ends and he wakes back up at the gate, the tension somehow becomes even worse, because now the audiences knows exactly what's coming. Devon Sawa plays Alex Browning with constant nervous energy, which works perfectly for the film. He doesn't feel like a traditional horror hero. He feels overwhelmed, confused, and terrified by information nobody else understands. Meanwhile, Larter's Clear Rivers becomes the emotional center of the story, bringing a calmness that balances Alex's paranoia. Then there's Tony Todd as Bloodworth. Even with limited screen time, Todd completely changes the atmosphere of the movie the moment he appears. His quiet delivery and cryptic warnings make death feel ancient, almost mythological. He doesn't explain the rules completely. He simply confirms the terrifying truth that Alex already fears. Death has a design. And once the survivors realize they were never supposed to leave that plane alive, Final Destination stops being a disaster movie and becomes something much darker. It becomes a countdown. What truly made Final Destination stand out wasn't just the concept. It was the way the movie controlled tension. Most horror films rely on a surprise, a loud noise, a sudden appearance, a quick burst of violence designed to make audiences jump for a few seconds before settling back down. But Final Destination does something much more uncomfortable. It forces the viewer to sit inside anxiety. Every death sequence unfolds like a puzzle. The camera lingers on ordinary objects long enough to make them feel suspicious. A knife block sitting on a counter, water dripping across tile floors, a computer monitor sparking in the corner of a room. The audience starts mentally connecting everything together, trying to predict how the disaster will happen before it does. And sometimes, the movie intentionally tricks you. One object appears dangerous, only for something completely different to cause the accident instead. That unpredictability became a part of the film's identity. Viewers weren't just watching the characters anymore. They were studying the environment itself. The most famous example is Todd's death early in the film. What begins as a quiet bathroom scene slowly transforms into pure panic through editing and sound design alone. Water leaks onto the floor. A wire tightens unexpectedly. Every small movement feels catastrophic. The sequence is horrifying precisely because it feels accidental. Nobody is chasing him. Nobody is attacking him. Death simply manipulates the room around him until escape becomes impossible. And that's the idea that made the movie deeply unsettling in a way most slashers rarely achieved. Behind the scenes, the filmmakers focused heavily on practical effects to ground the accidents in realism. Instead of leaning entirely on CGI, many sequences use physical rigs, stunt coordination, and carefully timed chain reactions to make death feel tangible. That realism mattered because the movie needed audiences to believe these accidents could genuinely happen. And audiences absolutely believed it. After the film released, people started talking about everyday situations differently. Turbulence on airplanes suddenly felt more intense. Highways felt more dangerous. Even harmless household objects carried a strange sense of paranoia. Final Destination had accomplished something rare for horror. The fear had escaped the theater, and had followed people home. As the survivors begin dying one by one, Final Destination slowly reveals what the movie is really about. Control, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. Alex spends most of the film trying to solve death like it's a mathematical equation. If he can understand the pattern, maybe he can stop it. Maybe he can save his friends. Maybe he can prove that fate isn't permanent. But the more he fights against that design, the more powerless he becomes. And that idea hit differently in 2000. The world was entering a brand new millennium, filled with technological optimism, internet expansion, and excitement about the future. But underneath that optimism was quiet anxiety, fear of disasters, fear of randomness, fear that life could change instantly without warning. Final Destination tapped directly into that uncertainty. That's part of why the movie connected so strongly with younger audiences. The characters aren't superheroes. They're teenagers and young adults standing at the edge of adulthood, suddenly realizing how fragile life actually is. Graduation trips, friendships, parties, and future plans all disappear in seconds because of one unpredictable event. The movie takes the normal invincibility of youth and completely destroys it. And visually, the film reinforces that dread constantly. James Wong filled scenes with shadows, cold lighting, reflections, and narrow spaces that make the world feel claustrophobic even in open environments. The wind moves through rooms almost like an invisible presence. Everyday locations, kitchens, bathrooms, train tracks, start feeling hostile. Death is never shown directly, but the movie constantly reminds you that it's never far. And then there's the pacing. Unlike many horror movies from that era, Final Destination doesn't rush. It lets tension breathe. The audience knows something terrible is about to happen, but the film delays it as long as possible, forcing viewers to sit inside the anticipation. That slow buildup became one of the franchise's defining trademarks, because the scariest part wasn't always death itself, it was waiting for it. That lingering anxiety turned Final Destination into more than just another early 2000s horror movie. It became an experience audiences physically felt while watching it, a movie that made people grip armrests, scan backgrounds, and nervously laugh while imagining how easily ordinary life could suddenly fall apart. When Final Destination released in March of 2000, nobody expected it to become a franchise. On paper, it sounded almost too strange to work long term. There was no central villain with a recognizable face, no iconic weapon, no clear mythology explaining how death operated, and yet, audiences immediately connected with the idea because the concept itself was universal. Everybody fears dying, but Final Destination made people fear randomness. That distinction changed horror completely. The film earned strong box office numbers and quickly developed a reputation through word of mouth. Teen audiences especially gravitated toward it because it felt different from traditional slashers that were dominating the era. Instead of asking, who is the killer? Viewers started asking something much more interactive. How is this going to happen? That became the franchise's secret formula. Every sequel would eventually try to top the previous film with larger disasters and more elaborate chain reactions. But the original movie remained the most grounded. The deaths feel messy, uncomfortable, and frighteningly plausible. There's a realism to the first film that later entries intentionally leaned away from in favor of spectacle. And strangely, that grounded realism is what made the first movie so culturally powerful. For years afterward, people reference Final Destination constantly in everyday life. Airplane turbulence immediately triggered memories of Flight 180. Small accidents suddenly carried an exaggerated sense of danger because audiences had been trained to think in chain reactions. The movie essentially created its own psychological language. Even people who had never seen the film understood the reference when someone joked about having a Final Destination moment. That's incredibly rare for horror. Very few movies manage to permanently alter the way audiences think about ordinary situations. Behind the scenes, the success also helped establish New Line Cinema as one of the most defining horror studios of its era. Combined with franchises like Nightmare on Elm Street and later the Conjuring universe, the studio became known for high-concept horror built around memorable hooks. But unlike many horror franchises, Final Destination didn't survive because audiences loved a villain. It survived because audiences loved the feeling. That unbearable tension, that creeping paranoia, the terrifying sense that disaster could be hiding inside even the smallest moment. By the end of Final Destination, the survivors are exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Every attempt to escape death only seemed to delay the inevitable. Friendships collapse under paranoia. Trust disappears. Even moments of relief feel temporary because the movie constantly reminds the audience that death's design is still moving forward. That hopelessness gives the film its lasting emotional weight. Most horror movies end with victory. The monster dies, the curse is broken. Someone survives long enough to see the sunrise. But Final Destination refuses to offer any real comfort. Even when the characters believe they've beaten death, the movie quietly suggests the pattern never truly stopped. And that ending became iconic. Without relying on massive spectacle, the final moments reinforce the film's central message. Death cannot be cheated forever. It may pause, it may wait, but eventually, the balance corrects itself. That randomness of life remains completely outside of human control. That cynical tone separated Final Destination from many horror films released around the same time. The early 2000s were filled with teen horror movies built around cool characters and crowd pleasing finales, but Final Destination leaves audiences unsettled instead of triumphant. There's no emotional release waiting at the finish line, just lingering anxiety. And honestly, that's probably why the movie stayed relevant, because life itself rarely gives perfect closure. Behind the scenes, the filmmakers intentionally avoided explaining too much about death's design. Tony Todd's Bloodworth offers hints, but never complete answers. That mystery allowed audiences to project their own fears onto the story. Some viewers saw fate, others saw destiny, coincidence, or even punishment. The movie never fully defines the force hunting the characters, which somehow makes it feel even more believable. By the time the credits roll, Final Destination has transformed ordinary life into something terrifyingly fragile. Airplanes, bathrooms, train tracks, kitchen appliances. The movie quietly rewired audiences' relationships with everyday objects. And once that paranoia has settled into your mind, it's hard to completely shake it away. And that's the real reason the film endured. Not because of gore, not because of shock value, because it convinced audiences that danger could be anywhere. More than 25 years later, Final Destination still occupies a strange place in horror history. It was never treated like prestige horror. Critics at the time often focused on the dialogue, the teen drama structure, or the movie's brutal cynicism. But audiences understood something immediately. This concept is unforgettable. And over time, the film slowly evolved from a successful studio thriller into a genuine cultural phenomenon. Because very few horror movies permanently change audience behavior. Jaws made people afraid of the ocean. Psycho made showers feel unsafe. And Final Destination made everyday life feel unpredictable. That legacy became larger with every sequel, but the original film remains the purest version of that idea. The fear came from anticipation rather than shock, and that's why the movie still works. Modern audiences already live with constant anxiety. News alerts, disaster footage, viral accidents spreading instantly online. In many ways, Final Destination feels even more relevant now than it did in 2000, because the world itself feels more unpredictable. The film taps into the uncomfortable realization that life can change in seconds for reasons completely outside of our control, and that fear never really ages. The movie also helped redefine supernatural horror for the 2000s. Instead of relying on invisible monsters, it proved audiences could fear an invisible idea. Countless later horror films borrowed from that approach, focusing more on atmosphere and psychological tension rather than traditional villains. But beyond its influence, Final Destination survives because it created memories people still carry with them. Those reactions became a part of pop culture itself. And maybe that's the strangest achievement of all. A movie about death became unforgettable not because it showed audiences something unrealistic, but because it reminded them how fragile ordinary life already feels. Beneath the suspense, Final Destination understood one terrifying truth better than almost any horror film of its era. The scariest things are those we cannot control. There's a reason Final Destination still lingers in people's minds decades later. Not because of a mass killer, not because of blood or gore, but because the movie understands something deeply human. Most people already carry quiet fears within them every single day. A fear of flying, a fear of accidents, a fear that life can change instantly for reasons nobody can predict or explain. Final Destination didn't invent those anxieties. It simply forced audiences to finally look at them. And once you do, it's hard to stop. That's what makes the original film so powerful compared to many of its sequels. Beneath the elaborate deaths and suspenseful set pieces is a surprisingly existential horror movie about inevitability, about the illusion of control, about how fragile ordinary life really is beneath routines we assume are permanent. The movie arrived at the perfect moment, right before the world changed dramatically in the early 2000s. Final Destination captured a specific feeling lingering beneath the surface of the millennium: uncertainty. The sense that disaster could arrive without warning, that no matter how carefully people plan their futures, fate could interrupt everything in seconds. And somehow, that fear still feels modern. Because today, we live surrounded by constant reminders of unpredictability, viral accidents, breaking news alerts, disasters replayed endlessly across screens. Final Destination almost feels like a blueprint for modern anxiety-driven horror. A movie where the tension never fully disappears because the danger exists everywhere. That's why the film endured, while so many other early 2000s horror movies faded away. It wasn't just entertaining, it changed behavior. And maybe that's the legacy of Final Destination. Not because it scared people for 2 hours, but that afterward, it made the world feel just a little more dangerous.